Hey y'all, it's Dr. Mandy Croy, researcher, editor, and your new best friend. And this is Dr. Mandy Unedited. A couple weeks ago, we discussed the first part of my literature review series where we discussed how to find papers, how to plan, how to organize for writing your literature review. Last week, I also shared a free How to Complete Your Literature Review in 90 Days guide that can help you plan and write your literature review week by week. So, if you think that's going to be helpful to you, it doesn't really matter if you haven't started your literature review yet, or if you have already started your literature review, you might find this helpful. So, be sure that you check that out on the digital download section of my link tree or on the media page of my website, www.drmandyedits.com. And those are both in the description below. So make sure you go check that guide out. Okay, today we are going to discuss writing the literature review. So, the actual writing part of it, okay? We're going to cover how to synthesize and critically analyze, and we're also going to talk about some elements that you should include in each section. But before we get into it, I just want to see how y'all are doing. What's going on? And, do you have a personal life? Sometimes in academic, that becomes our entire life. But I don't know, I had a pretty good weekend. Whenever I record these, it is usually after a weekend. I know this comes out midweek, but I did bottomless brunch this weekend, and that's the second time I've done bottomless brunch. First of all, I'm not really like a go out and do stuff type of person. I have a social butterfly husband, so he's the one that forces me to go out and socialize and do all of this fun stuff, which is amazing because, yeah, I get to do so much stuff that I don't think like I would normally just go and do on my own. And so we've done bottomless brunch a couple of times now, and I'm not sure, like I've never done it in the US, so I don't know if it's any different, but it's kind of wild, let me tell you. It's a fairly popular thing that I see in the UK on the weekends, and it's you get a meal and then you get basically all the booze that you want for about 2 hours time. So I'm not that big of a drinker. I only, could do maybe 3 or 4 drinks over a really long session. So like having that time limit is like a little bit intimidating for me. So we went and did that with some really great friends of ours, and it definitely is pretty fun, I can't lie, but it is quite intimidating because the place that we go to tends to, be just bringing drink after drink. They're always at your table, taking your order, ready to go. I usually don't really, I usually only get maybe 3 drinks in, and I'm totally happy with that. So anyway, I don't know. Do you guys do brunch? Is that really a thing in the US? Again, I've never really tried. In the UK, I think it's like kind of like an up and coming thing. Maybe you're listening from somewhere else. Let me know if you like brunch. But anyway, okay, let's just get into it. Let's go ahead and talk about the literature review and what is generally included in a literature review. First, you have an overview section. Of course, every chapter has some sort of overview section. Next, you have a theoretical or conceptual framework section. And then you have the big review of literature section, which is, what we're going to be focusing on the most today. And then, of course, you got a conclusion, which we're not going to talk about today. We'll talk more so about like the specifics of introductions and conclusions later on in life. But there also might be other sections involved in your literature review depending on your school, such as the most oftentimes I see an extra section that outlines how you found all of the literature that you're going to include. So sometimes you have to state what search words you used in your databases. You have to state like what your criteria was for each paper and all of that good stuff. So make sure that you check on your school guidelines and what you need to add for any of those extra sections that we're not necessarily going to talk about today. But let's go ahead and start with the overview first. So this sets the stage as it does in every other chapter, but this section is the why it matters part of your literature review. And so in this section, we really want to see a clear overview of your research topic. So you may restate the problem and the purpose statements here. You may give a little bit of a brief historical context. And then, if you don't have that section I just talked about, talking about all the different things that you researched for this chapter, you might just mention a little bit about the scope of your review, or basically what was included and what was not included. And then you might also include in your overview section just some key definitions of terms. And so I know I will say this many times throughout our times together on this podcast. However, when it comes to key terms, make sure you stick with those key terms throughout your whole manuscript so the reader knows exactly what you are talking about. I see like too many times where people state their main themes, such as like if you use the word homeschooling, for example, and then they refer to it as something like slightly different or like interchangeably throughout their document, such as instead of using homeschooling, maybe you'll refer to it as home education. However, those terms can be very different things. They mean different things in different contexts. So, if I'm somebody that's reading your document and I see those words being interchanged like that, it can become a little bit confusing just because I'm not sure if you're talking about the same thing or not. So make sure wherever in your manuscript you are defining key terms, make sure those are the terms that you are going to use consistently throughout your manuscript. Unfortunately, this is not creative writing. I think a lot of people fear in their manuscript in general is seeming too repetitive and repeating, like certain terms and phrases too often. But I mean, that is what we need for the consistency. Of course, you don't want to just repeat word for word every time. You want to change it slightly, but you will find throughout your manuscript that you will be repeating things often. So just make sure you keep those keywords, those key definitions you're defining consistent, especially in your literature review. In the next section is your theoretical framework. And this is where you show which lenses or theories shape how you view your topic. If the overview is going to tell the reader what's happening, the theoretical framework will tell us how you are interpreting it. In this section, you want to include key theories or models that inform your thinking. One thing that I see missing in these sections is like a good overview of the theory and how it became about. A lot of times I just see people kind of define the theory and that's that, but a good background on like how that theory originally came up is always really helpful. And then how has it evolved over time? That's always like a really interesting thing to see, is how, especially if some theories are quite old and have been derived even like, in the 50s or the 60s or something like that. But as, our social, our cultural, our whatever contexts evolve, those theories have evolved to really fit those means as well. So it's always good just to kind of tell us how they've evolved and how they fit into our current state of time. You may also want to include any definitions of core concepts for your theory and a rationale to why your theory is appropriate for your study. Some people do this kind of by doing like a backtracking situation, and they explain all of the other theories that they considered for their study with a brief rationale as to why that one didn't necessarily fit into the purpose of your study and your research questions. And then they go back and explain how exhausting all of those other options make the theory that you chose the most optimal theory. I've seen other people also do this by analyzing their chosen theory and how it has been used in similar studies, and then justify how their theory will work for their study by kind of like comparing and contrasting the strength of that theory in various other studies. But overall, this section becomes a story of the foundation of your study. I think I said that in the previous episode on literature review, is that the theory is kind of our foundation of our study, right? And so we're giving a really solid overview into that foundation. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about the part that is looming in everyone's minds. Let's go ahead and talk about the review of literature section. Okay, so the review of literature section, this is the heart of your literature review. You're not just reporting on what other researchers said. You're going to be synthesizing, comparing, analyzing their work. And so in this section, you want to focus on showing patterns, themes, agreements, contradictions in the literature. And you also want to highlight gaps and what is unexplored so that the reader really starts to understand how your research fits in. So let's figure out how we're going to accomplish this. Last week, we talked about creating a comprehensive outline for your literature review. So if you did that, you should have about 3 to 5 major themes. Hopefully, they include several bullet points and sub-themes and some citations under each of those 3 to 5 major themes. So when we begin writing this review of literature section, we are basically just going to focus one theme at a time. And you can even think of these themes as like mini papers. So like maybe like a mini 7 to 10 page paper for each of these 3 to 5 main themes. Hopefully that makes it feel less like you have like an ocean of information and more like you have some maybe small lakes. I don't know. But for each of these themes, we are going to just go section by section or like heading by heading or topic by topic, however many little, sub themes or topics that you put under each of these main themes. We're going to go topic by topic, and we are just going to review all the papers that we had included for those sections. So for each section, you should have several papers that you thought really fit into that section. And then we're just going to critically analyze. You've probably already started doing this as you've been reading your papers, but it's time to amp up our brain power a little bit. Critical analysis means engaging with the research. So we're not simply summarizing, but you're going to look at the papers that you have allocated to each section of your mini outlines, and you're going to ask questions like, how strong is their evidence? What is missing from their argument? Are there any biases? How is this info useful to your research? And most importantly, for like every paper, you really want to ask, so what? How does each study add to my understanding of what I am studying? And then why is this important to my work? It's important that all of this information that we have gathered, we are showing collectively how it is relevant to our study. And so maybe as we are critically analyzing, before we even really get into writing anything, you might want to start adding key information or insights to your outline as you ask yourself these questions. So hopefully on paper and in your mind, you really start to see your argument forming. And once you feel like your brain probably wants to explode through your eye sockets, then it's probably about time to start really writing. So again, we're just going to focus on one theme at a time, one section at a time, and let's talk about synthesizing. As you are critically analyzing papers, it is important that you are synthesizing them in your writing, not simply just summarizing. So we do not want to see only one source after each sentence as you're writing, but we want to see many sources within one set of parentheses. So while you're writing, if you find yourself reading back through a paragraph and you see that you just have like one sentence, one source, one sentence, one source, one sentence, one source. Or you have maybe like a whole paragraph dedicated to one paper, and you have that happening a few times throughout the section or throughout your this theme that you're focusing on. If you're seeing that, then you need to put on the brakes, because I see people get away with that way too often in their writing. And yeah, it's just basically summarizing, and that's not what we're trying to get at. Synthesis is about connecting the dots between sources and creating your overall understanding. So, as you're writing, think of it like this. If you went to a party and then maybe you witnessed some drama go down and you were just hearing everybody talk about it, and you heard all of these different people saying all this different stuff. And then, the next day you call up your BFF who wasn't at the party, and you were just like, oh my gosh, listen to all this stuff that I found out. First of all, you wouldn't tell your BFF, okay, so-and-so said this, and then so-and-so said this, and then so-and-so said this, and then so-and-so said this, because that would just be so long-winded, and your best friend is probably just like, oh my God, get to the point, right? So you wouldn't explain it, just by what each individual person at the party said about this drama. You would probably already in your mind be collectively trying to say like, okay, well, this side said this kind of vibe about this issue, but then the other side, they were saying this about the issue, but that side, they have a bias because they're best friends with the person who started the drama. Basically, what I'm trying to say is instead of just saying so-and-so said this and so-and-so said this, we need to figure out what's the collective vibe of what people are saying on the topic. So follow that pattern section by section under your major theme. So for each heading and sub-theme, you should be looking at the papers you allocated for that section, critically analyzing them, and then synthesizing what you found in your literature review. Once you've done this for all of your headings in one theme, then you're going to move on to the next theme, and then the next theme, and then the next theme, until, oh my God, you have a literature review. As you start to complete your literature review, some important things to follow up on are, number one, transitions. So once you kind of get the overall chapter kind of completed, make sure you're reading, each paragraph, and especially between each section or each theme, and making sure that each topic is kind of flowing smoothly into the next. I think a lot of times I see people give kind of a really hard stop in the topic and just kind of all of a sudden jump into the next one. But if you do that over and over again, it does kind of get a little bit cumbersome. So make sure that you've got some really nice transitions in between your sections. But also, once you're done, check your citations. Check your citations, please, because I think a lot of times people get into the thick of writing their review of literature, and they're thinking in their head, maybe I'm just going to put those citations. I'll go back and check those citations, later, or I'll drop those citations in later. But then when it gets to your editor, aka myself, I often see a lot of times, people have just completely forgotten to cite the information in their literature review, or they have forgotten to put the citations that they had for their literature review into their reference list. And so oftentimes when I'm editing literature reviews, it does become quite a process of going back and checking all of those things. And then I have to tell, my client, hey, you have all this extra work that you have to do. And I hate doing that, because I think a lot of times people are just hoping that once they get to the editing process, that their time writing this paper is done. So make sure that you go back and you check that all your citations are in the right place, and that all of your references are in your reference list, so that you don't have all this extra work to do later once, your editor has to point it out to you. And after that, y'all, you may just have yourself a completed literature review. So, let me know where you are in your literature review. What's your literature review process? Are you just starting it? Are you in the trenches? But if you need some help, remember I do have that 90-day guide linked in the digital download section of my link tree or on the media page of my website, and all that information is in the description below. Otherwise, if you need more help or if you need an editor, you can get a hold of me through my email, which is mandykf@gmail.com. So that's mandiekf@gmail.com, or on my website, www.drmandyedits.com. All right, y'all, that is enough for me. Next week, we're going to be talking about how I chose my dissertation topic, and then the next week, we are going to discuss how you are going to choose a dissertation topic. So tune into that. Until next time, don't stare at your computer too long or your eyes will get stuck that way. I don't know. What did they used to say about the TV? Who knows? Go touch some grass, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.